Hello, I'd like to welcome you to this little video that I created some time ago. It's the story of the village of Eyam, and it has significant parallels to where we are today. So I hope you enjoy it. It's just over 8 minutes long, and it tells the story of a happening very much like we're having here, but in a village in Derbyshire in the early 17th century.
My name is William Montpesson. My story began not long after I and my wife, Catherine, together with our 2 young children, moved to the small village of Eyam in Derbyshire, where I had taken up the position of rector. I had only been there a short while when great misfortune struck the village. It happened this way. One of my parishioners, George Vickers, lived in the local tailor's cottage and had taken delivery of some cloth from a merchant in London. It had become damp, so he had placed it near the fire to dry. Within 4 days, George had died. It would seem that he had been bitten by infected fleas released from the cloth by the heat of the fire. But there were worse tidings to follow. Over the next 3 weeks, 5 more deaths occurred in the neighbouring cottages. The plague had begun. Young Emmet Siddle lived in one of these cottages. She was engaged to be married to Roland Torr, who came from nearby Stoneleigh Middleton. On hearing of this, Roland came to comfort his sweetheart, but she was worried that he too would catch the plague and begged him to stay away. He finally agreed, but they arranged to see each other in the Delph, where they would call to each other across the valley. One day there was no sign of Emmet. Undeterred, Roland continued to make the daily journey in the hope of seeing his betrothed. The wealthy and influential soon began to leave, and I tried to persuade my wife also to take the children and stay in Yorkshire. The children did go, but Catherine was determined to stand alongside me. We had hoped that when winter came the plague would subside, but the deaths continued into the spring, and we realized that unless something was done quickly, it would spread to the neighbouring towns and villages. I met with my predecessor, Thomas Stanley, and together we prayed that God would show us a way to contain the disease. An idea came to us, and we presented our proposal to the community. Firstly, there would be no more funerals or churchyard burials. We asked the villagers to bury their dead close to their homes, in gardens or nearby fields instead. Sadly, many could not afford gravestones, and had to suffice with a simple cross scratched on a small stone to mark the place where their loved one was buried. There were many personal tragedies, but perhaps the most heartrending of these was when Mrs. Hancock lost her husband and 6 children in the space of just 7 days. Not only had she lost her entire family, she suffered the anguish of digging each grave herself, after having dragged their bodies to a nearby field to bury them. The second part of the plan to be implemented was to close the church, but so that worship could continue, the community gathered together in the Delph. Here I found a suitable place from which to preach. The final part of the plan was to create a boundary. This self-imposed quarantine was perhaps the hardest part to accept. However, the villagers, helped by their deep Christian convictions, embraced the plan, and a boundary was placed around the village. The Earl of Devonshire, who lived in nearby Chatsworth House, became our chief benefactor. At his own expense, he provided food and medicaments, which were placed at the southern boundary of the village for those of us living in the village to collect and distribute. Other requirements had to be procured elsewhere, and these were placed at the well or some of the boundary stones. To avoid contamination, the money to pay for anything was left in running water or soaked in vinegar. My wife and I laboured long and hard helping the sick and dying, but it was a work of love, and her love and devotion helped me bear the terrible burdens. Then one evening, whilst walking back to the rectory, Catherine remarked how sweet the air smelled. It was a moment I will never forget. I knew this was one of the first symptoms of the plague. Well, Catherine had never been strong, and so, mercifully, she suffered only a few days before the end came, but oh, how bitterly I wept as I cradled her frail, lifeless body in my arms. I fear, too, that my own death may also be imminent. In recognition of her ceaseless sacrifice, a special dispensation was given to bury Catherine in the churchyard. Thanks be to God. How hard it was to write to our children and tell them of their mother's death. Between September 1665 and November 1666, 76 homes were visited by the plague and 260 of the 350 inhabitants died. As quickly as the plague had started, so it suddenly ended. The final death occurred on the 1st of November 1666. Although many died in Eyam, the sacrifice made by the villagers undoubtedly prevented the spread of the plague. But the cost was high. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Eventually the community started to return to normal life as people came back to the village. One of these was Roland Tall. He came in search of his beloved Emmet, and only then did he discover her fate. She had died on the 29th of April. Grief-stricken, he never recovered from this terrible loss and remained a bachelor until his death.
Ring a roses, a pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down. Ring a roses, a pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down.